So this paper is really about the depositors. In general, this paper is a bigger reflection of my overarching research ambitions, trying to understand when it comes to a lot of our global challenges, whether it be climate change, tax evasion, or corruption, under what conditions do we have natural disciplining forces within financial markets? And so this is very much inspired by the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. So what you see here in this picture, not too far from here. And what was amazing was because it brought a lot of people on site to the scene of the protests because of a pipeline that was intended to cross Native American lands. Environmentalists came to the fight as well, and so did, in this picture, U.S. Army war veterans. But as a movement, this was amazing, but when it comes to the topic of today, what happened in the background was 700, this is in February 2017, this is around 8 months after the protests really started, 700,000 people were demanding their own banks to stop financing the Dakota Access Pipeline. These were people who signed one of 6 petitions demanding this, and collectively they had reported to having over $2.3 billion US invested in these banks through checking accounts, mortgages, credit card accounts, and by this time thousands have already closed their accounts, removing over $55 million US and counting. But before I dig into that, so taking a step back, what do we know about depositor discipline? We know that depositors serve a monitoring role for the banks, and we know that they discipline banks based on 2 channels. Either they withdraw deposits or they require higher interest rates. But so far, the concentration has always been on financial fundamentals. The moment I think my bank is about to go bust, I discipline them based on these 2 channels. And my big overarching questions with this project is simply, does this traditional discipline behavior hold for other sources of information? And I tackle that by asking 3 questions. First of all, do depositors react to information that goes beyond financial fundamentals? And I'll be testing that to see whether depositors react to bank scandals. Secondly, if yes, is that because of financial motives or something more, such as altruism or social motives? And 3, if I do show that people are indeed taking their money out of banks, where does it go? That's the 3rd question. Do non-scandalous banks get rewarded for their behavior? And as a quick glimpse to the findings, I do 2 analyses. One is I look at 100,000 branches in the US and I exploit the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And I do, in fact, find that branches across the US, whose parent banks financed that pipeline, had a negative significant decrease in deposit growth. And these effects were greater for the branches that were located closer to the pipeline, as well as for branches that were in environmentally or socially conscious counties in the US. And for the 3rd question, where'd the money go? Savings banks were among the main beneficiaries of this movement. And as a second analysis, I have global scandals that I've hand collected, as well as global banking data, and I show that this is very much a global phenomenon. This is not in the US, it's happening elsewhere as well. Don't want to go into the literature too much, but the main thing I want to highlight is a bit of a topical debate on, by Hart and Zagalis and others, should corporations maximize shareholder value or shareholder welfare? The main argument there is, if you're the owner of a firm, you have an equity stake, and you, let's say, want to give higher wages to your employees, that makes financial sense. That makes economic sense. And my contribution here is simply saying banks should condition their corporate policies on the non-financial preferences of their creditors. But let's go to the pipeline. So the pipeline starts from North Dakota, South Dakota, continuing to Iowa and Illinois. The yellow area over there is where the on-site protests took place. It was intended to cross Native American community lands, and that's how the fight first started, but because it was also intended to cross Missouri and Mississippi River, that's why the environmentalists came along, and as I mentioned, as time continued, even the U.S. Army veterans joined the fight. But where are the banks in this? So 17 banks project financed this pipeline. And the banks that have significant branch level presence here in the US are these 9 banks: Citibank, BNP Paribas, Wells Fargo, TD Bank. And they use the FDIC data set looking at the 100,000 branches across the US for 2012 to 2017. The reason why I want to show you this picture is because this event took place during a live football game in Minnesota. in US Bank Stadium. Protesters climbed on top of the stadium and hung this large banner that said, US Bank divest for the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, for me, in the beginning, I was a bit confused by this because if you see from the list here, US Bank is not here. So why were they targeting? So as I did more interviews, I came to understand that there was a lot of confusion in the beginning between NGOs because they weren't sure whether to tackle the project financing banks or also the corporate financing banks. So there's a lot. US Bank was a corporate financing bank, and there was a lot of other banks that were also involved in this group. So the majority of the analysis that I'll show you today will be when it comes to these project financing banks, but if I'll have time, I'll also show you that these effects really much took place for also these corporate financing banks. But on the timeline, April 2016, on-site protests start. July is when the FDIC data comes out for the branch level data. But good for me is that September is the first mentioned in the media that I am aware of, and I was able to personally contact the first person who wrote an article on this, specifically stating which banks were involved. And from there on out, this just continued. In December, major petitions started. February is when that 700,000 person petition came out, and it just got bigger as time continued. And then FDIC data comes out in July 2017. So that is my treatment year. And this is, to give you a bit of a graphical representation of the movement, this heat map is based on the treated branches, so the branches that finance that pipeline. Darker color simply means, on average, these branches were doing fairly well across the US. This is 1 year before the scandal, and once you hit the treatment year, you start seeing it gets light across the board. And this is, for me, when it comes to a social movement, when this became really a national phenomenon. In terms of social movements, you don't need to really travel on-site to the protest. You can protest right from your own home, from the couch, go online, and move your account. But where's the econometrics? So this is the main result of the paper. If you were a branch that financed that pipeline in 2017, you had a negative significant decrease in deposit growth of approximately 2%. On average, deposit growth is around 8%, so it's a significant hit to these branches. And if you multiply the amount of branches times the amount of deposits they have, this translates to something between 8 to 20 billion US dollars of foregone deposits for these branches. But then let's look at the additional motivators. So where's the story here? One is testing proximity. So what I find is that if you were one of the branches in 2017 and you're located in a pipeline state where that pipeline was actually taking place, you had an additional negative significant effect. Furthermore, I used data from the Yale program on climate change communication. This is county level data from the US that gives the estimated percent of adults who think global warming is happening. And that's what I see as well. If you finance that pipeline, it's 2017, and you're in a county where more people think global warming is happening, there was an additional negative effect. And if you want to dig further into this personal responsibility, this is another interesting component of the data set on the percentage of Americans who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities. So I also use this as well to show that the effects are very much there as well. And as a last channel of social aggravators for this movement, I use partial data from social capital literature, and I have county level information on the number of nonprofits in a county. And I was hoping this would be a way to proxy for local willingness to tackle societal issues. And that's what I see here as well. The effects are greater in these counties. But then the third question that I mentioned to you, where did the money go? This was very coordinated to a certain extent. So NGOs specifically told a lot of their members and the general public, take your money out of these big bad banks, put it to something more local, like a savings bank, or I'm not allowed to mention this, but a credit union. And some of the outlets provided something like this. You would go online, you enter your zip code, search, and it will give you a list of the local savings banks and credit unions. And that's what I find as well. If you're a savings bank in 2017 and you're in a county with more Dakota Access Pipeline financing banks, you had an additional positive increase in deposits that year. FDIC dataset doesn't include credit unions. So what I did was I took credit union data from the call reports and I put it in this data set to also show that they also had that positive increase. But again, knowing my audience, I won't show you those results. Cannot talk about scandals without specifically targeting Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, as many of you know, has been going through a lot, whether it be creating fraudulent accounts or selling insurance to their customers that they did not need. Graphical representation of this is from the S&P. This is Wells Fargo's 11 months of scandals. This came out a year ago. So there's plenty more than just this. And most interestingly, for my situation is, this doesn't even include the Dakota Access Pipeline. So why is it important that I mention this? Wells Fargo has a lot of branches in the US, so one might argue this is a Wells Fargo story. This happened at the same time. So to tackle that, I basically run our analysis where I drop all the Wells Fargo branches, I check whether all these effects held for the other banks, and the effect is very much there. The pipeline story is here. And as I mentioned, there was a bigger group of banks as well. So as time went on, NGOs collectively decided, okay, we're tackling the big group. And this is the big group. That includes project financing banks as well as corporate financing banks. And it includes everything from US Bank, PNC Bank, JP Morgan and Chase, Credit Suisse as well. I got to mention, I'm really lucky. I'm very glad that you're my audience, because last time when I presented this, the moderator in my panel was actually from Credit Suisse. Could have been awkward, but she was very, very nice, so it was all right. Overall, I check all the same stories, and there are intricacies there. The fundamental results are the same. If you were a member of that bigger group, you also had a negative significant decrease. The coefficient size is smaller, and that can be because of many things. Odds are it was only until the end of that year when there was only this bigger collective pressure. In terms of the other channels, they exist as well. Again, coefficient size is a bit smaller, but interestingly, for example, in terms of proximity, it seems that for the people who are closest to the pipeline, for them it didn't matter if you're project financing or corporate financing, you were targeted. But what happened afterwards? The Trump train arrived and the pipeline continued in the end. So does it really matter? Well, in the end, there was massive financial consequences. February, Seattle cuts ties with Wells Fargo because of this scandal. February is also when ABN AMRO and ING start reevaluating their commitment to this project. February, Nordea starts excluding companies behind the DAPL. As time went on, ING was the first one to sell its stake in the project financing loan. Then DNP and BNP Paribas continued on that as well. San Francisco moved to divest from DAPL companies. Interestingly, Norwegian pension funds as well were involved. Native American communities in the US joined forces with the indigenous communities of Norway, the Sami people, put pressure on the pension funds there, and they also divested from the DAPL companies. US Bank is an interesting case study. They specifically told the NGOs, look, we've heard your case. We are making a public statement. We're not giving loans to pipeline companies anymore. NGOs were confused. They didn't take it seriously, but then they hailed them as a good guy. And then they noticed a few months later on Bloomberg, US Bank is giving more loans. So that's an interesting story by itself. US Bank states, we were talking only project financing, not the other stuff. So that was interesting. LA moves to divest from Wells Fargo. Norwegian Wealth Fund starts divesting. And if you think this movement has stopped, no. So March this year, Citizens Bank sold their stakes to one of the loans aimed at the DAPL companies due to public pressure. And want to make the case clear here, there are members of Citizens Bank here. This is not the same Citizens Bank. So this is a very specific one. And this movement in general is happening with Keystone XL tar sands operations. And to this day, what I've understood from my interviews with NGOs is people are still to this day taking their money out. So this is not the end. And to conclude, I collected a global set of scandals. This is not just a US scenario. This is a Greenpeace campaign against Santander at the time. They were providing loans to Indonesia to a company that was driving deforestation. And that became a bit of a campaign. And so what I did was I collected all kinds of major cases related to corruption, environmental issues like this, or Carmichael coal mine project in Australia, or even tax evasion. For those who remember LuxLeaks or Panama Leaks, these weren't just major events against traditional companies, but very much the banks as well. So after having collected that data set, I also show that this is, and using a global data set on banks, I show that this is very much a general phenomenon. So banks, when they get hit by a scandal, deposit growth goes down approximately 2%. This is on the quarterly level, and average quarterly deposit growth is around 2%. And if you're more interested in which stories are more present here, tax evasion and environment, that's where there are significant effects. Corruption is a bit different. When it comes to these kinds of scandals, whether it be LIBOR rigging or else, it's really hard to pinpoint the beginning, the middle, and the end. So it's hard to identify this as the most conservative approach. I'm simply looking at when that scandal started. The corruption effects are there as well, but it needs to be dug a bit further to understand where is that key moment in time in terms of public attention. To conclude, basically, I show people do care, and they reflect their social values on terms of how they allocate their deposits. And for me, this is simply a new, surprising, and important disciplinary channel for bank behavior. Thank you so much.
Thank you.